In more headlines, 2 British and 1 Moroccan man fighting with the Ukrainian army have been sentenced to death by a proxy Russian court.
Our main story is the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss will speak to her Ukrainian counterpart today to discuss the case of 2 British men who've been sentenced to death after being captured by Russian forces whilst fighting in Ukraine.
An unrecognised court in the rebel-held area of Donetsk found Arden Aislinn and Sean Pinner, along with a Moroccan man, guilty of being mercenaries. Francis Reid has this report.
Britain has called it a sham judgment with no legitimacy. Yet both of these men could face death by firing squad.
Didn't really have any other choice other than to surrender.
This is Arden Aislinn during the battle for Mariupol. Both he and Sean Pinner were captured back in April. Now they're part of Russia's propaganda war, with Moscow claiming they're foreign mercenaries.
They may be killed quickly, a shock value, but as everyone expects they're not, then they will be held as a diplomatic tool. And I think the bigger picture here, what is happening, is that the Russians are going to become increasingly aggressive as part of the indirect conflict against the Baltic republics, against the Poles, against the UK and others who are close to the Ukrainian administration.
It's true that foreign fighters signed up alongside Ukrainians after the Russian invasion, but that's not the case for Arden and Sean. They'd made their lives in Ukraine some years ago, serving in its armed forces for several years prior. A US Army medic trained Arden Aislinn.
He went to Ukraine in 2017. He has a Ukrainian fiance. They do have, or did have, a home outside of Mariupol, and he was a part of the 36th Marine Brigade. So, yeah, he had a well-established life in Ukrainian citizenship.
Kremlin-backed media showed the men arriving for sentencing in Donetsk yesterday, which is under the control of pro-Russian rebels. The court's not internationally recognised, and the UK Foreign Office says it's a breach of international law to prosecute them, a view supported by the Ukrainian government.
The main problem is that Russia, they don't follow any, rules of war. They don't follow anything. That's my main message. There is no international order for them. There is no international rules for them.
The Foreign Secretary is expected to speak to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister this morning in an attempt to secure their release. Russian state media suggest the men have a month to appeal against their death sentences. But condemned men, or simply a bargaining tool? Ultimately, that's something that could be decided by President Putin himself. Francis Reid, BBC News.
Let's get more on this with our correspondent Nick Beak, who's in Kiev. Nick, morning to you. Now, all of this happened in a court in Donetsk, and the fact is that that's not an internationally recognised area. So it adds more layers of confusion to this as to who exactly is breaking which international laws.
Good morning, Naga. Yeah, it's a confusing picture, this, and I think at its heart you've got a court which is not accepted by any country in the world to be free or fair or capable of delivering justice. No country in the world acknowledges it to be free and fair, apart from Russia, of course. But we are now at the mercy of the way that this court works, and so we're told the men want to appeal and they've got 30 days to do that. We're also told that the head of this place where the trial the sham trial, as the UK calls it, where it's taken place, he has the power to reduce these sentences, because at the moment the men face death by firing squad. We're told that the head of this place could reduce the sentence to 25 years in prison, or possibly give them a life sentence. But I think we need to be clear here. It's President Putin who really calls the shots here. The men are in the mercy of his decision-making. They're in his hands. And so that's why Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, today is talking to her Ukrainian counterpart, trying to work out what's going to happen. Now, if there is to be any glimmer of hope for the families of the men, it is that there have been other death sentences passed in this part of the Donbass, the eastern region of Ukraine, but they haven't been carried out. And certainly the families will be hoping, of course, that that continues for some time. But this is, as you say, a very unclear, murky situation. Maybe the men may be used as some sort of bilateral, or they might be involved in a prisoner swap, but at the moment we've got no details of that. So a lot of concern, of course, predominantly for the families, but also for the British authorities, who say they will be doing what they can, and they'll be talking to officials in Moscow to try to ensure the release of the men.
Nick, thanks very much for bringing us that view. Nick Beak there for us in Kiev.
Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who's in Westminster. Nick, we were just hearing there about some of the politics around this and those discussions Liz Truss will be having. Tell us more.
Yeah, morning to you, Charlie. I mean, the view of the UK government is that this is a sham judgment, that these men were both fighting in Ukraine legitimately as part of the Ukrainian forces and are therefore protected under international law, the Geneva Conventions, which are supposed to decide how people are treated if they are captured as prisoners of war. Russia says that these men are mercenaries, which the Foreign Office here completely dismisses. There is going to be a discussion between Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary here, and her Ukrainian counterpart later today, where I've no doubt this will be a big issue. There has been some pressure from local MPs representing these men for the Foreign Office to speak directly to Russia and maybe summon the Russian ambassador. There is some reluctance from some in government to do that, though, because they don't want the UK government to be directly engaging with Russia on this, because they fear that it might aid that idea that these two men were British mercenaries. The UK government says they're absolutely not. They were there fighting legitimately, and therefore they have protection under international law.
At the morning papers, a Soviet-era show trial. That's how The Guardian's describing the death sentence given to Aden Aslin and Sean Pinner, two British men, pictured here, on the left, who were captured whilst fighting Russian forces in Ukraine.
Putin's pawns is the headline in the Metro. You can see there, the paper says there's fear the two prisoners will be used as bargaining chips following the sham verdict.